Hey guys, welcome. How you doing? Week 3 of pandemic lectures, and today we've got an awesome one, The Road to Revolution. With all due respect to the Beatles, you say you want a revolution, all right? As Miss Ulrich just did, this is very much a cause and effect event 2 from 1763 to 1775. Make sure she had a great timeline at the end of her video. Make sure you know that timeline. Every action that the colonists take has a reaction from the British and vice versa. All right. So right after the French and Indian War ended, there were still problems west of the Appalachian Mountains, which is a key geographical dividing point. The French, as Miss Ulrich said, left, but the Indians had nowhere to go. And so they continued to rebel. This was called Pontiac's War. And this is when Britain really begins to reassert control over the colonies. They've already spent a lot of money defeating the French. They don't want to spend more money defending the colonists. So they draw a line down the middle of the Appalachians, and they basically tell the colonists they are not allowed to settle west of the Appalachians. The colonists who had just fought for that land were very upset by this, but this is just the beginning. What's key here, guys, is that in 1763, the American colonists were incredibly proud and happy to be members of the British Empire and the favored colony. And the story of this next 12 years is how do they go from being happy colonists to basically revolting against the most powerful empire on the planet in 1775. This is the key one. If you know anything else from this time period, you have to know the Stamp Act. All right, this is when, as Miss Ulrich said, after the French and Indian War, salutary neglect ended. This is the act that ended it. They tried a small measure in 1764 called the Sugar Act, where they tried to make a little bit money. This was the last of the Navigation Acts. It didn't raise nearly enough money, and the British government was broke. And they wanted the colonists to pay their fair share. And they put on a direct tax on the colonists for the first time. A stamp back then was any wax seal put on a paper product. This could have been anything from a newspaper to a business contract to, believe it or not, a deck of playing cards. Okay, you can see from the one picture that the colonists were a little bit drama queens about this. They basically noted that the stamp would actually lead to their death. They called it, "Oh, the fatal stamp." Okay, please make sure you know the Stamp Act and the colonial reactions to the Stamp Act, which are these. All right, number one, and this is one thing that is going to really make the American Revolution difference, is the colonies Congress. Okay, like a lot of revolutions are very bloody, and there will be blood in the American Revolution, but their first reaction was to Congress, to meet together, to discuss it. All right, and this is going to be a continuing theme throughout this entire process. They also boycotted any paper products that the Stamp Act had, and they boycotted other British goods, and there was some violence, okay? Tarring and feathering sounds funny, and possibly could be funny if you were watching it, but if you're the one being tarred and feathered, it probably would lead to your death, so that's not so funny. And they tarred and feather a number of stamp collectors, okay? That violence is probably going to be the key one of these. The thing that was most successful to this were the boycotts. So mainly due to pressure from British merchants, the Stamp Act was repealed. The colonies went crazy. They had parties. They made teapots. This was a great old time. We managed to defeat the accursed tax. However, they failed to note that at the end of the Stamp Act repeal, the British also added on the declaratory tax, which said they had the right to pass any laws and taxes in their colonies for any purposes they saw fit. This is going to cause continuing problems. Things move on for a couple of years. This was not a fast-moving revolution. Things kind of move slow, but the story didn't change. Britain still needed more money to run its empire, and they wanted the American colonies to pay. So 2 years later, in 1767, they passed the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were a tax mainly on tea, lead, paper, and glass. Okay, now to remember this, I have a theory. Don't ever use this theory in an essay, but it's a good theory. Now you start getting some very serious responses to British measures. Okay, after the Stamp Act, the guy who cried out the loudest was a personal favorite of mine, and that was Sam Adams. Okay, now Sam, as you can see, was a brewer first, but he was also a patriot. Okay, and Sam in 1765 was the loudest voice to break away from the British Empire. But in 1765, after the Stamp Act, nobody wanted to leave the British Empire. Everyone enjoyed being part of the British Empire, and they kind of ignored him. My theory is Sam looked at the Townshend Acts and said, oh, they're just picking on me. They taxed lead. That's where I make my beer. They tax paper. That is my label for my bottle. They tax glass that my bottle's in. And they tax my tea that I enjoy after a hard day at work. Okay. Now, this is not true, but it's a good way to remember the Townshend Acts. He starts really railing against the Townshend Acts in Boston, but now the other colonies get involved, specifically a guy from Pennsylvania by the name of John Dickinson. Now, here's where you have a connection. Pennsylvania was the colony of William Penn. William Penn wrote the Charter of Liberties, and if you remember from last week, in the Charter of Liberties, William Penn was the first guy to write down in words the concept of no taxation without representation, which John Dickinson well knew as a Pennsylvania colonist. And this becomes the rallying cry of the colonies against British taxation. Once again, Sam is out in the streets yelling for revolt, yelling for rebellion. And after the taxes went away, most people just go back to their jobs. Okay. They're like, okay, Sam, yeah, you're a little crazy. Go back to work, calm down. All right. But then Sam gets the event he's been waiting for. In 1770, after some locals got a little annoyed with the British troops, it was early April. There was a little snow on the ground, and some of the colonists thought it would be really funny to throw snowballs at British troops. The British troops were actually pretty self-restrained. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Some people say, people in the crowd were going, "Go ahead, fire, fire." Probably not the smartest thing to say with people with guns. Some people say that the commander actually gave the order to fire. Whatever happened, they fired around. 5 people died. These are the first casualties of the American Revolution. Now, if you look at this, Sam had his good buddy Paul Revere make this picture and send it all over the colonies. This is not an accurate representation of what happened in the Boston Massacre. There's no snowballs. It looks like the colonists are just standing around and purposely getting shot. But this is what Sam wanted: propaganda. He wanted the rest of the colonies to know that the British were horrid and we needed to fight back. Once again, though, things slowed down. The British calmed things down, and life moved on. And then finally, the British passed a Tea Act. Again, they still needed money. This is the continuing theme. And this time, Sam went too far. Okay? He thought it would be fun to get some of his friends, the Sons of Liberty, which was the organization he created after the Stamp Act, and he thought it would be fun to dress up as Native Americans and destroy all of the tea in Boston Harbor, which was being boycotted because of the Tea Act. This was a step too far for even most colonists. Most of the editorials in newspapers criticized Sam and the Sons of Liberty. Private property was sacrosanct in English law. Colonists believed in private property, and they didn't want this either. However, this time, and here's your cause and effect, now the British did not have patience anymore. They had patience after the tarring and feathering of the Stamp Act. They had patience after the repeal of the Townshend Act. They had patience after the anger of the Boston Massacre, but the destruction of 800,000 pounds of tea in Boston Harbor was a step too far. They responded. The effect was the direct punishment of Boston and the coercive acts. They closed the harbor, which was basically like completely shutting down a town at that time. There were no roads. Town meetings, which are very important, think back to the Puritans, were completely banned. The townspeople must quarter troops in their homes and pay for their meals. And this was basically putting a military ring around Boston as a warning to the other colonies. Here's what we're going to do to Boston. This is what we will do to you if you mess around anymore. This had the exact opposite intended effect. The rest of the colonies saw what happened, and instead of getting nervous and scared, they got worried, and they said, if they can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. Once again, continuing theme, what do the colonists do when really pushed to the edge? They Congress. Okay, the First Continental Congress met. They didn't accomplish a lot. Mainly, they agreed to meet again and call it the Second Continental Congress. But more importantly, they created a little institution known as Minutemen. I like you guys to remember Minutemen by thinking these are your dads, okay? These are lawyers, doctors, teachers, shopkeepers who keep a musket under their bed and are willing to go out and defend their livelihood, all right? And that is exactly what happened. In 1775, early April, the British troops, as Miss Schacht will go into more detail, went to go find arms in Lexington. And on Lexington Green, the first pitched battle of the American Revolution actually started by accident. The shot heard around the world, and 8 dads were left dead on Lexington Green. After this, however, and after what happened at Concord, the colonists chased the British troops all the way back to Boston and actually killed and wounded over 175 British troops. And now King George was angry. You don't kill British troops. Now we are going to punish the colonies. Before this could happen, a second pitched battle, much larger, happened outside of Boston, where the colonists had surrounded the British Army, and this became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, technically, the British won this battle. They conquered the hill, but only 200 Americans lost their lives. 1,200 British troops were killed, and the colonists thought maybe, just maybe, we could win if we decided to revolt. All right, this was a key concept before the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. Now, after Bunker Hill, guys, people in the colonies still did not want to revolt. Revolting against the most powerful empire in the world, that's not a smart, rational choice. But in the spring of that year, a guy by the name of T-Pain, no, not the rapper, wrote an important pamphlet called Common Sense. He was actually a recent immigrant from England to the colonies. And basically he said, why should a country 3,000 miles away be controlled by a small island? Okay. Again, common sense. And because of the Puritans, the United States was a very literate society. A lot of people read this, and this had a major influence on changing a lot of people's minds and turning a lot of people into patriots, which Ms. Schacht will talk about at a later point in this video. That finally led to the Second Continental Congress. At the Second Continental Congress, that very tall redhead in the middle there by the name of T. Jefferson will write the Declaration of Independence, and Mr. Irvin will go into depth about the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. Please learn your story of the road to revolution. It is a key concept in this class. Thanks, guys.